The Unknown Citizen by W.H. Auden. 2JS/07M378. This marble monument is erected by the state. He was found by the Bureau of Statistics to be one against whom there was no official complaint, and all the reports on his conduct agree that in the modern sense of an old-fashioned word, he was a saint, for in everything he did he served the greater community. Except for the war till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired, but satisfied his employers, Fudge Motors Inc. Yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. Our report on his union shows it was sound, and our social psychology workers found that he was popular with his mates and liked to drink. The press are convinced that he bought a paper every day, and that his reactions to advertisements were normal in every way. Policies taken out in his name prove that he was fully insured, and his health card shows he was once in hospital but left it cured. Both Producers Research and High Grade Living declare he was fully sensible to the advantages of the installment plan and had everything necessary to the modern man: a phonograph, a radio, a car, and a Frigidaire. Our researchers into public opinion are content that he held the proper opinions for the time of year. When there was peace, he was for peace, and when there was war, he went. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenist says was the right number for a parent of his generation, and our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. Was he free? Was he happy? The question is absurd. Had anything been wrong, we should certainly have heard. We should certainly have heard. We should certainly have heard.
Hi, welcome to Litpoetry. W.H. Auden was a poet, author, playwright, and a leading literary influencer in the 20th century. Known for his chameleon-like ability to write poems in almost every verse form, Auden's travels in countries torn by political strife influenced his early works. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1948. The Unknown Citizen was first published in The New Yorker in 1939 before appearing in Auden's Another Time in 1940 alongside some of his most famous poems such as Funeral Blues and Musée des Beaux-Arts. Auden had emigrated from England to America just before the start of World War II, and the poem itself uses Auden's characteristic humour and deft touch to examine what is actually a rather troubling subject. The poem is clearly a work of dystopian literature, a genre that really grew in popularity during the 20th century. Like Orwell's iconic dystopian novel, 1984, The Unknown Citizen examines a society where an individual's thoughts and actions are seemingly controlled and regulated by the apparatus of the state. An interesting point to note, though, is that the poem predates the publication of 1984 by a decade. Within the poem itself, it is quickly apparent that the sound of the poem closely mimics and parodies the voice of an official government bureaucracy. Indeed, the poem adopts a kind of passive voice that represents a faceless and impersonal we. It is very much the voice of Big Brother who is watching. The context of World War II, of course, sheds light on the poem's subject matter as well. With the world falling into disarray and mayhem spurred on by the atrocities of Nazi Germany, with its ideologies of a master race, Auden witnessed firsthand the global growth of systemic racism. This was in turn backed up by the dodgy pseudoscience of eugenics, which is referenced in the poem itself. The Unknown Citizen is historically fascinating in the way that it criticises two very different ideologically driven societies. The poem obviously points towards the Soviet Union and its methods for the top-down control of citizens in the poem's regular references to surveillance and state control. The reference to the Bureau of Statistics and high-grade living have connections to their historical counterparts in the Soviet Union. For example, the instalment plan probably alludes to the Soviet Union's 5-year plan, which was implemented in an attempt to transform the economy into an economic juggernaut. Yet capitalist consumerism also gets rather strongly criticised in this poem as well, with its deep connections to the ideology of the American dream in Western society. The phrase modern man sounds like a page taken from an advertising guide, and Fudge Motors Inc. appears to be a reference to Henry Ford's company. Here Auden is pointing to those dystopic elements in capitalist societies that measure an individual's status and worth by the things they own, which is no less an ideology than with the beliefs found within communism. Auden points to the fact that both communism and capitalism have the capacity to oppress their citizens. Form. At its heart, The Unknown Citizen is an extremely ironic poem in the form of a parody. This parody is clear in the opening epitaph of the poem, describing the unveiling of a statue dedicated to a citizen, known only by his identification number. The form that the poem adopts is a continuous stanza of 29 lines. This makes the poem sound a lot like a report or a declaration. Indeed, the poem intentionally resists the use of beautiful language or heightened emotion. The poem simply lists all the endorsed and agreeable things the Unknown Citizen did right during his life, and the various ways that he was closely watched by the state. Two rhetorical questions at the poem's end indicate that freedom and happiness are absurd concepts in this particular dystopia. Metre. The Unknown Citizen certainly makes use of metre, but not consistently. Indeed, the metre is somewhat uneven, drawing down mostly on the use of anapes, which is a 3-syllable foot that goes da-da-dum, unstressed, unstressed, stressed. But there are still variations in rhythm throughout. Lines 9 and 10 are nearest to featuring this anapestic metre in its pure form. Yet he wasn't a scab or odd in his views, for his union reports that he paid his dues. The loosely anapestic sound gives the poem a chirpy, lackadaisical quality, which is intentionally in conflict with how serious the occasion is being described. It's a funeral after all. In reality, this juxtaposition between frivolity and seriousness helps to cement in place the poem's disquieting sense of irony. Rhyme scheme. The use of rhyme is important in The Unknown Citizen. However, there is no regular scheme. The rhymes are disorderly, sometimes using tidy couplets, while at other times the rhymes sound more spread out. Again, one could argue that Auden uses his disorderly rhymes to further reinforce the poem's sense of irony. This is not an emotionally felt or delivered elegy after all, rather it is a farce. The state doesn't actually sympathise with the Unknown Citizen, and as such, this lack of care is reflected in the seemingly haphazard and random and insecure rhymes on display. Moreover, the almost frivolous rhyming sounds create dissonance with regards to the seriousness of the subject matter, which after all is a man's entire life. Lines 6 and 7 are a good case in point. Except for the war till the day he retired, he worked in a factory and never got fired. These lines account for the Unknown Citizen's whole career, but they sound more like a limerick or a nursery rhyme. If the speaker of the poem, the state itself, or a state representative sincerely admires the Unknown Citizen, perhaps they would strike a more sombre tone in the discussion of his death. Then we have the 3-line rhyme in lines 25 to 27. He was married and added 5 children to the population, which our eugenicist says was the right number for a parent of his generation, and our teachers report that he never interfered with their education. These rhymes sound very unattractive, robotic and mechanical, all relying on the ending shon. Remember, this is meant to be a tribute, but these rhymes create the feeling that we are reading a business report into the productivity of a human life rather than an emotional commemoration. Themes: control, oppression, conformity, and freedom. The Unknown Citizen is written in the form of an elegy, a poem that fondly remembers a person who has recently died. The word clearly is related to the word eulogy, a speech given at a funeral. This elegy, however, is a parody of this solemn form. For example, whereas one would usually expect a distraught relative or friend to compose an elegy, it is the faceless state that delivers the commemoration for the dead citizen. Like a blood-sucking insect, the government officials drain the emotional life, any sincere sentiment or heartfelt grief out of the elegy's messaging to leave behind a poetic yet lifeless husk. The poem is thus hollow, just like the citizen himself. In the end, the citizen is only valued for his absolute conformity to the system. By subverting the elegy form, Auden here creates a playful, yet at the same time uncomfortable sense of humour and irony. Moreover, this approach by Auden delivers a powerful critique of modern society by arguing just how dangerous it can be for a society to give too many powers to those in charge. The poem also looks specifically at how surveillance in society can oppress people, through the state knowing everything about its inhabitants. The title is therefore ironic, of course, because the state clearly knows everything that there is to know about the unknown citizen, and I mean everything. In a society like this, Auden argues that freedom is not truly obtainable, even though on the surface, those in power claim to be offering people a good and materially rich lifestyle. Of course, the poem has serious ramifications for us in the 21st century as well. This is because those in positions of power have more data about who we are as individuals than at any other time in human history. Like Auden's citizen, powerful institutions collect our data and use it against us. After all, knowledge is power. Indeed, one could argue that in most Western democracies today, while people are not controlled or oppressed too much by heavy-handed government officials like in the poem, the true officials in power pulling the strings and shaping the narratives of our world are not so much those in government, but rather they are those in the control of powerful corporations, advertising agencies and technology companies. In other words, in a capitalist society, we too can be good citizens, or considered good citizens, just so long as we remain good little consumers who do our part to support the systems as they currently exist. The thought police in the world today simply monitor our purchasing habits, turn us into predictable sets of data, and then go about designing algorithms to control our innermost desires and thoughts without us really ever knowing about it. Though on the surface the poem is praising the life of the dead unknown citizen, it only does so because this person lived a textbook example of an obedient, non-questioning life. In the poem's world, a good citizen is one who does everything they're supposed to. Indeed, that's why the speaker, the creepy we of the poem, begins by offering what is probably the highest compliment in a dystopia. There was no official complaint against the dead man. In other words, he never did anything wrong. If he had, the state would certainly have heard about it, revealing the frightening reach of their view into people's lives. In writing this poem, Auden points to one of his main criticisms of the state, that its use of surveillance can destroy any true sense of mystery, joy, or freedom in life. The state underhandedly influences every area of the dead man's life, and thereby the poem sounds kind of like a list of all the ways a state can trample on a person's liberties. The state controls what is acceptable, the citizen's working life, his sociability, his opinions on the news. his personal possessions, his attitude to his children's education, and so on, and thereby turned him into a kind of mindless slave. The state even controls and subverts the language used within the society to comply with its own interests. For example, it redefines what notions of sainthood are by associating the word with how well a person serves the oppressive system, rather than if they lived a morally virtuous or just life. The poem also implies that modern society, in an effort to optimise productivity and happiness, has made everyone essentially the same and robbed life of the kind of individuality that makes life meaningful in the first place. The state makes out that the man possesses freedom to choose his destiny. However, the reality is that the man's choices are an illusion. Added to this, the poem takes special aim at the world of advertising, suggesting that it sells falsehoods about individual happiness that actually amount to further conformity. The poem describes how the dead man's reactions to advertisements were normal. He thought what he was supposed to think, and accordingly he bought all the items that advertisers wanted him to. A phonograph, a radio, a car and a fridge. And it kind of sounds like what we're exposed to today, doesn't it? While advertising encourages people to make purchases as a way of defining and expressing their individuality, Auden also points out that consumerism leads just as much to conformity as it does to individuality. In the end, Auden's poem is a cautionary tale which asks people to question the relationship between the state and the individual, and to examine whether governments, or other powerful institutions for that matter, actually have our best interests at heart. The dark and disturbing humour embedded within this poem challenges us to open our eyes and look again at the world to which we belong. Thank you.